Hello, welcome back to Between the Hashes, everyone. Our weekly college football primer coming to you from Los Angeles, California. I'm your host, Matt Keim. I'm wearing black because I'm in mourning for my precious Ohio State. But there is still more to this season and way more football to be played and way more interesting storylines to be resolved. Namely, that there are 8 teams still alive for the 4 slots in the college football playoff. There are a ton of different combinations that we could see, and a lot of chaos that could potentially occur. Now, one of the reasons for this is that going into this, we have 4 undefeated Power 5 teams. We've never had that many. It's never been more than 2 or 3. At this point in the season. And so I wanted to go through each of the conference championship games instead of highlighting one specific game, because there are so many different variables and so many different combinations that could come out of the next couple days of football. And we will find out the answers this Sunday morning. I'm going to start with a team that's actually not playing this weekend, but is still very much alive. Last week's loser of the game, the headliner game of last week, Ohio State. For the record, Ohio State fans calling for Ryan Day to be fired, shut up. I'm not going to elaborate further on that. You're being dumb. Stop it. Why are they still alive? Well, to be honest, they're finding themselves in the same exact position that they were in last year. For those of you who might need a refresher, here's what happened with them last year. They had a win over a ranked Notre Dame team and a win over a ranked Penn State team. One was at home, the other was on the road. Both of which were fairly competitive games, in which they eventually pulled out late. They had an end-of-season loss to a Michigan team that would go on to win the Big Ten championship, and then both they and Michigan made the playoffs in the Final Four after a couple of chaotic scenarios involving, most notably, chaos involving the Pac-12 and ACC conferences. Enough space got cleared out, and Ohio State still had the resume, still had the strength of record, still had a lot of advanced statistics going for them, and the committee still decided that their only loss being to one of what they thought at the time were one of the 2 best teams in the country, they still deserved a shot at the playoff. Could that happen again? Yes, but it will not be as clear-cut or straightforward as it was last year. The following probably needs to happen, and I say probably because even then, it still might not happen. And so, even though they're 6th in the rankings in terms of likelihood to make the playoff rank, the likelihoods of going to make the playoff, I would put them at 8th. The first thing that would need to happen is Florida State would need to lose in the ACC title game. The second thing that would need to happen, Alabama would need to lose, and Texas would need to lose. So 3 teams ahead of them would need to lose. And more than likely, Oregon would probably have to lose as well. Could that give Ohio State enough of a runway, especially with the road win over Notre Dame, and now that Penn State has found their way back into the top 10 in the committee's ranking, with a top 10 win and a top 20 win on the road on their resume, would it be enough? I think it could happen. I also think that too much needs to happen. Moving on from Ohio State, let's preview some games. We'll start with one of the games tonight, Oregon-Washington, which was an absolute classic of a game last month. Now, if you remember, if you guys have been watching the show all season, you'll know I highlighted that specific game that week, and I said the next week we'll probably see a rematch of these 2 teams come December because they were just both that good. And so here we are. The last 6 or so weeks since these teams have last met, each team has taken a very, very different path. Oregon has just looked straight up dominant, and they're playing a lot of common opponents. Utah getting blown out at home by Oregon, but then turning around and hanging tough with Washington. So there's a lot of commonalities opponents. And Oregon is actually currently favored by 10 in the Pac-12 title game in Las Vegas tonight. Now, here's one of my frustrations with Oregon. Oregon's resume is kind of below Michigan's, below Georgia's. They don't really have any quality wins. And I certainly think Utah should be ranked, and so they should have at least one ranked win. But even then, they're kind of being given credit for winning a game that they lost. A lot of the discourse surrounding Oregon and Washington has been, well, of course Washington won, they were at home. Well, the better team didn't win. I still thought Oregon was the better team. Well, they lost the game. Sure, there's a lot of arguments you can make, and then to one way or the other, and that game really did come to a few close calls. I do think Oregon is a significantly improved team. Part of the optics problem here for Washington is that they have not looked great. Michael Penix's passing has dropped. His accuracy has dropped. Bo Nix on the other sideline has overtaken him in overall passing and passing completion percentage in all of FBS. There are noticeable dips in quality in terms of Washington's play. They had to survive against Oregon State, they had to survive against Washington State, they had to survive against Utah, and all three of those teams, Oregon played in that same stretch and dominated all three games. And so there's a little bit of transitive property happening here. It's just a little bit frustrating to hear discourse about two teams that already played, because transitive property doesn't work in sports. Washington is being dinged for losing a game that they won in a lot of ways. You could make the argument that if Oregon dominated that game in Seattle and they were 12-0 and Washington was 11-1, Washington would be the lowest ranked of the one-loss teams instead of Alabama currently. And Washington would need to come out and destroy Oregon. But if Oregon were to lose a close game, they would still have an argument at the playoff. If Washington loses, they're out. They're done. It's done. It's over. The Heisman's gone. Pac-12 is gone. Playoffs are gone. Washington's in a bit of a no-win scenario as far as that's concerned. Having said that, let's look at the game. So what happened the last time these two teams played? It was a tight back-and-forth game. For a while, Oregon looked like the better team, then Washington always had a counterpunch. Like I said, it came down to the very last drive and the very last play. And so because it was such a coin flip game, I think statistically it's just more likely that Oregon's going to win this game for all the perception complaints that I've just had about that. The spread is 10. I gotta be honest, I see Washington covering here because even though they have looked bad, and honestly, they probably should have lost to Arizona State, they still keep finding ways to win, and when you're in the stretch run of a season, sometimes that's more important. Do I think they're the more talented team than Oregon outside of a few positions like receiver and quarterback? No, I don't. They certainly can win, and I'm going to give them the respect of at least covering a double-digit spread, because I think Oregon probably should win this game just because beating a team twice is really, really hard to do in the same season. And we've seen a number of scenarios in the Pac-12 in the last couple of years where teams have had to play twice. It happened last year with USC and Utah. However, Utah won both of those games. And then when Oregon and Utah played in the Pac-12 title game a few years ago, Utah still won both of those games. So part of me thinks that Washington is still going to pull this one out. I just think that the analytics favor Oregon a little too much here. So like I said, Oregon wins, Washington covers. Let's move on. All right, next one. Oklahoma State versus Texas in Texas's final conference game as a member of the Big 12. So a lot of people, myself included, thought that Oklahoma would get another shot and we'd see a rematch of the Red River game. That's not what happened. Oklahoma lost in Bedlam and to Kansas within the span of about 3 weeks of each other. And so it's a very, very different scenario with the Big 12 we got. We have a Oklahoma State team that was hurt by injuries and transfers, and to be honest, looked really bad. They got blown out at home by South Alabama, and 2 weeks ago they lost by 42 to UCF. However, they still keep finding ways to win big games, like against Kansas State, like against Oklahoma. Will it be enough? Oklahoma State's big advantage as a team is boasting the nation's leading rusher, but they're going against a team that is very hard to run the ball against. A team with a very good defense and a very good defensive line, especially. I don't think this matchup favors Oklahoma State very much. I think Texas wins. I think they cover the 15.5-point spread, and Texas will move to 12-1 and be one of the likely members of the Final Four. Michigan is favored by 22 over Iowa. Good Lord. Okay, let's be honest. The real Big Ten championship game happened last week for the second year or third year in a row. And I know that, you know that, they know that. Iowa has averaged something like 18 points a game on offense, and they mustered 13 last week against Nebraska. And in all honesty, a really bad special teams call cost them the game against Minnesota. And arguably they should be 11-1. That's not the world we live in. I gotta be honest, I just don't see how Iowa scores points here. I just don't see it. Especially with the momentum that Michigan's going to have coming out of that Ohio State win and getting Coach Jim Harbaugh back on the sidelines. By the way, news about that scandal has not gone away, but it has died down for right now, so there will be more on that in the offseason. Like I said, I just don't see how Michigan not only loses but fails to cover here. I'm going to go Michigan. I'm going to go take the points. This thing's over by halftime. All right, now we get to some of the closer championship games. Let's go to the ACC, and I am saving the best for last on this one. ACC, Louisville takes on Florida State. Florida State was initially favored by a little bit more than they currently are. The line has fallen to 1.5. There are rumors that quarterback Tate Rodemaker has actually been suffering from a concussion sustained from a hit that resulted in a targeting ejection at the end of the Florida game. Look, it wasn't Rodemaker's first game action. There was a little bit of injury issues last year, and he had to come in relief duty. It's not like he's completely green, but if he's compromised, and the internet is going wild with rumors on this one. Some are saying he's healthy, some are saying he's not. They found themselves struggling against Florida. They are not the same team on offense without Jordan Travis. Having said that, there is precedent for what they are trying to do. If they can go out and make a statement the way that Ohio State did almost 10 years ago now, they can still make the playoff. I think Louisville, especially with the Jordan Travis news, they have the better quarterback. I think I trust Louisville actually a little bit more than Florida State. Despite the wonderful season Florida State's had, I'm going to take Louisville in a slight upset over Florida State, which would knock them out of the playoffs. So I'm going to roll with the Louisville Cardinals here. All right, there is one game left. Georgia and Alabama. So the last time these two teams met in the conference championship game was actually the last time Georgia lost. They have now since won 2 straight national championships and 29 straight games. They're going for number 30 right here. I think it's fair to say that Alabama has grown significantly as a team since we started the season with them, since they lost by double digits to Texas at home, since they mustered 17 points against South Florida, since they blew a double-digit lead against Arkansas. However, there are still lots of inconsistencies. They were down double digits against Tennessee. They needed a miracle act of God, 4th and 31 conversion from quarterback Jalen Milroe, who is playing his best football. And to be honest, he is going to need to play the game of his life to pull this out. From a defensive standpoint and a coaching standpoint, these are two very, very evenly matched teams. Kirby Smart, outside of maybe Dabo Swinney, is the only person with a resume and the acumen to match what Saban's resume has been, especially in Kirby's case because he was there for half of those titles as a coordinator. But let's look at Georgia. A lot of us were a little bit concerned for Georgia, myself included, for a couple of reasons. Their offensive line looked shaky to begin the year. Their quarterback play was a little shaky on and off to begin the year. They had injuries to Brock Bowers, who many hold up as one of, if not the best player in the country. And much like Alabama, they had a shaky game against their rival in Georgia Tech. The difference between what Alabama did and what Georgia did is that Georgia held out almost half of its offensive starters and a number of defensive starters to rest the game. And so if you're going to excuse or look at things like game control, Georgia was never really in danger of losing that game. Alabama had to drive back and come back and win. I don't want to go transitive property because Georgia struggled just as much against Auburn in that same stadium just a month or two ago, the way that Alabama did. But it is worth noting that the context for both of them struggling last week were very, very different. Weirdly enough, for a team that is being held up as the top team in the country, their quarterback has gotten almost no attention. Carson Beck is one of the best quarterbacks in the country. His accuracy, his decision-making has all been very solid. And Georgia's offense has been steamrolling people. And a lot of people really started to take notice, especially with that Ole Miss game. And the games like where people kind of called for an upset or like a close game. Like I made this mistake when they played Kentucky. They came out and destroyed them. The big question with Georgia, Ole Miss and Missouri were their 2 biggest games, so they really haven't been tested the way that like an Alabama or an Oregon or an Ohio State or a Texas or a Michigan had been. Does this Georgia team have when it really matters? Because this is not the same quarterback that won the first 2/3 of those 29 games. How does Carson Beck do when the spotlight is at its brightest? The line's only 5.5. This thing is going to be a brutal defensive game, a very violent game, and I kind of lean Georgia to not only win but cover here, just because I think their margin for error in how they can win this game is a little bit wider than how Alabama can win this game. I think Jalen Milroe and his receivers will need to play the games of their lives. They haven't always been able to do that. Alabama's defense has grown significantly as well. There were issues in the secondary at the beginning of the year, especially injuries. They're much healthier now. I just think that covering guys like McConkey and Bowers, all while trying to match them blow for blow from an offense that has been at times limited and at others inconsistent, is going to be a little too much for Alabama to overcome. So I like Georgia to win. I like them to cover. So if you've been paying attention so far, here are the 6 conference championship winners that I have picked: Oregon, Texas, Georgia, Michigan, and Louisville. I'm going to make a Final Four prediction right now because in my predictive scenario, Georgia wins. They're in as an undefeated 13-0 team with now 3 top 15 wins, I think. Michigan follows shortly behind them with 2 top 10 wins, potentially 1 top 5 win depending on where Ohio State shakes up in the rankings, and a 3rd top 20 win over Iowa. And then we get to a really interesting part because there are 2 spots and potentially as many as 4 or 5 teams fighting over those spots. The remaining couple of teams would be a 12-1 Pac-12 championship Oregon, a 12-1 Big 12 champion Texas, an 11-1 non-champion Ohio State with a resume that matches some of these other teams, and Alabama and Florida State bringing up the rear, especially Florida State as a 12-1 non-champ. This scenario, my final playoff predictions, and I'm going to put them in the order that I would see them, would be 1 Georgia, 2 Michigan, 3 Oregon, 4 Texas. That's going to be our Final Four, guys. That's my prediction. And that is all I have for you guys this week. Thank you for sticking around to the end. I hope you guys have been enjoying this season. I will be back next week with some early reactions to the playoffs, Heisman predictions, and a prediction to the Army-Navy game. And remember, come back here for more updates on the Washington Commanders. Are they going to get a new coach? What's going to happen with that team? Follow the latest on them through the John Keim Report, and you can find that here on Empire Media on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, guys, and enjoy the games.